So we talked last week about the definitions that we use for people migrating into another country. We wrote those up on the board and talked about how some of those had positive connotations, some didn't. We talked about how those might be looked at differently from a cultural or even a legal perspective. So I thought, to give you an idea of the complexity of this, because do you remember me talking about refugee might have one definition culturally or even politically, it has a different definition legally, right? So to give you an idea of the complexity, I thought I'd show you a list. It's probably not even up to date because this changes all the time. But this is a list of the current legal classifications that someone migrating to the U.S. could hold. These are possible things.
Whoa.
Okay? So you see, some of them have names that you can make sense of, like asylum, and some are like 245A or 240. You don't know, who knows what that means. Child Status Protection Act. If you're here, criminal background. If you're here, current, not current. If you're here, the titles don't even make sense, right? That looks like a lot, doesn't it? That's page 1. Right? Dream Act, you notice that one. Right? These are all legal classifications that somebody could have who is in some degree of immigration status into not a natural born citizen, in other words. That's a lot. That's just page 2. Right.
He's a permanent resident.
Yeah, lawful permanent resident.
Yeah.
Right. You could have marriage fraud you might even make a movie about that with Ryan Reynolds and
That was a great movie.
That was
whatever.
wonderful.
I can't remember. Sandy Bernhardt. That really is the last page. That's a lot. So combine that with what I told you last week, that there's 16 separate offices from 7 separate federal agencies involved in the immigration process, and this emphasizes how complex the system is and how easy it would be for someone to get confused about what their status is and to be in the country illegally with no bad intentions whatsoever. I mean, the easiest way to navigate this is to understand the system. That's really hard. Another issue that gets raised is the cost of all of these immigrants, right? Often said to be coming here for our social safety net. Why in the world they wouldn't want to sneak into Denmark or Sweden or Canada? Much better social safety nets. But that's the claim, right? People who are here for this variety of reasons, they may not understand what their classification is, and often the only way for them to really have a grip with the system is to have an attorney, a good immigration attorney, right? And maybe you likely don't have the money to do that. So there's a lot of pro bono work that gets done by immigration attorneys, but it's a drop in the bucket, of what is needed, especially in a system that's this complex. And even the immigration attorneys themselves, I've worked very closely with the TU Law Clinic at TU that deals a lot, and it's with students and then some hired staff as well, and they'll tell you, we can't keep this all straight. Right? Very complex. And changes all the time. And changes, we should note, and changes administration to administration more often by executive order rather than by an act of Congress. And why that matters is the executive orders almost always get challenged. Then they're in the court systems, And the court system might say, well, this is fine just as is, or the court system might make adjustments to it, and what's happening in the meantime for a person's legal status. So really, really complicated. And the one entity that actually could say this is what we're going to do is unwilling or unable to act.
And not to mention the executive order, the next president following
Sure.
could just
An executive order, it changes with every administration, right? We reverse them, we put this in place, and then we reverse them, and then we put this in place. And so we wonder why it is that there's a whole bunch of people at the border when every 4 years or maybe every 8 years things change so much. How long do you think that takes for that word to get downstream to people, even though they may not understand it in the first place, because we clearly don't? Using data from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, 2 scholars analyzed the cost and benefits of resettling an average refugee who entered the United States between 1990 and 2014. They estimate that the average cost of resettling a refugee in the United States during that time frame, 90 to 2014, they estimated that at about $15,000, including background checks and housing and English lessons and job training, that sort of thing. So kind of an ongoing little process there. In 2017, the University of Notre Dame study found that 20 years after their arrival, the average refugee adult has contributed approximately $21,000 more in taxes than they have received in governmental assistance and services at all levels. And so this is a commonly held thing. Well, they don't pay taxes. Yeah. Everybody pays taxes all the time, whether you pay your income tax or not. And I'm not pointing any fingers. But whether you don't do that or you do that, right, you're always constantly paying taxes through a variety of means. And so people who are here and are not paying income tax are paying all different kinds of taxes into the system. One of those academics noted that pundits may argue that our economy suffers when we welcome our immigrant neighbors. In reality, the immigrant community bolsters our economies at federal, state, and local levels, and that just gets proven again in every study they do. This comes out. I'm going to turn off the air conditioning. Is it cold in here?
No.
You're fine? Is it just me?
No.
Well, it's locked, so. You're just going to be cold. Sorry. Drink some more coffee, I guess. So that brings up the issue of how we talk about things versus the reality of things. And I think nowhere more starkly than in the last couple of elections have we seen this cycle of this being used as a wedge issue, but also nothing really being done about it. So then the question becomes, do you actually want to resolve the problem, or do you want to have something to run on? Right? Because it's a very effective tool in helping to run because of the issue of scapegoating. This is what we work so well on that system. Let's blame somebody else for our problems, and we'll take the weakest among us usually. Okay, so those are stats and numbers and the data. But what we really, of course, want to use and to make our decisions is the Bible, right? I mean, like data, stats, information, please. Well, even if you agree that was your sole source for... Okay. Well, I thought I'd get bigger pushback to the question of what we really want to use for our decision making is the Bible, and there was just nothing here. Yep. Right. But even if we do want to use it, and this is an example where we probably do want to lean on it, because the instruction from Scripture is really, really clear about immigration. or how we treat the stranger. So we'll talk about that in a second. Clearer perhaps than lots of other issues, and has lots to say on it. But we do have to wrestle with sort of the framework. So we talk about immigration, or we talk about borders, and we talk about border security, we talk about that sort of thing. Refugees, asylum seekers now over the last few years, we talk about that kind of thing. What the Bible talks about is from a very different culture, and a much more porous understanding of what the borders and lands and all of those kinds of things meant. They obviously didn't have big walls, they didn't have gates, they didn't have armed forces keeping people out in the same way that we might do. So they didn't have a legal structure in the same way that we do. So we have to think about the context being different. And then we have to think about those words from a biblical perspective. So I actually have a collection of scriptures that speak to what we would call immigration or refugees or the treatment of the stranger. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pages long.
See, you've got more text than those government documents.
Yes, 8 pages long, and little tiny font too, right? That's a little tiny font. Single space. And it goes all across the Hebrew Bible into the New Testament and carries a consistent theme. And that theme is essentially wrapped up in the Hebrew Bible. The phrase is, you shall welcome the stranger among you, for you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. It's almost like a refrain that gets repeated over and over. It gets repeated in liturgy to this day within Judaism. Then in the New Testament, you have that same sort of adage. You have the addition or the leaning on of what is present in the Hebrew Bible, but even more present in the New Testament, widows and orphans. Have you heard this phrase before? So widows and orphans, how we care for the widows and orphans among us, right? It's sort of a colloquial phrase. So if we think about in a patriarchal society, the man, the head of the household who is male, represents sort of all of the power. So if you don't have that male, if you are a widow, so you no longer have a husband, and let's say you also don't have a son to step into that position, the authority does not go to the woman. Now we have Bible stories that defy this all the time, but let's just set that aside for a second. The authority doesn't go to the woman. She is a widow. She is therefore sort of destitute. She has no authority above her to give her the necessary tools for survival. Same thing for an orphan. You have no father, you have no brother, you don't have the family structure. Everything is geared around that family structure with men at the top. Okay? We're hearing echoes of that today. A wish to return to that sort of atmosphere, right? Which, to be fair, is very biblical. They're not wrong about that. What they tend not to do is to read the stories that defy that model all the time, but that's a whole nother class. So all through the Hebrew Bible, you have that structure of remember who you once were. Treat this person well because you were once that person. And in the New Testament, you have this sense of be compassionate to those who are vulnerable. So we don't have the same structure now with widows and orphans, thank God. But We certainly have people who are vulnerable in our society. People who don't have access to the mechanisms of stuff simply because they don't have access for a variety of reasons and are therefore very vulnerable. And the instruction is to care for those people, right? As if they were widows and orphans. I was going to read some of these to you, but man, are there a bunch of them. How do I pick which one? So I won't. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of scriptures. Like, that the only thing that the Bible has more to say about than strangers or immigrants or welcoming the stranger is money. Talks a lot about money. Now, we don't talk a lot about money, but the Bible sure does.
That's my business.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So let's take a look at the ancient Hebrew words that are lifted up in calling for the care of the stranger or the sojourner, which is also another, like the traveler, essentially. So the word for sojourner in ancient Hebrew is gar, and it appears to be a loan word from the Canaanite language. So you had a lot of crossover in these Semitic languages in that area, and they would borrow words from each other like we do all the time, right? So, if you're going to go get a taco, guess what you're doing? You're borrowing a word from another language. The Canaanite language, this word gar, has its origins, this is kind of interesting, has its origins in like foam, like on the top of the ocean, or boiling up kinds of things. So that's stuff that's only temporary. It's there for a moment, and when the waves stop or things cool down, it's gone. While it is boiling into a foam, it's like stirring things up, and that foam is intermixed with all the ingredients of what is being boiled. And then when the foam disappears, everything is back to calm again or normal again. So when someone comes into a close-knit group, like a community, that person is a stranger whose presence can cause some kind of disruption in the normal proceedings of that community. That's the idea behind the word gar that we render as sojourner, somebody who travels in. The word stranger in Hebrew is toshab, which is really quite simply and directly applied to somebody who inhabits a land but really isn't a citizen, who has moved in from somewhere else. So a pretty direct thing. So you can see there's relationship between the two things, but the one word for sojourner implies the person is coming in and then moving on. There's a movement. So why is it important for that sense of having something for a sojourner and for a stranger? Well, these stories, especially in the Hebrew Bible, are written in a culture that is deeply influenced by geography and by the necessity of that geography. So this is the ancient Middle East, let's call it. Okay, so you have some very familiar places here. What I want us to pay attention to is that this is all desert. Okay? This is all desert. This, up into here, is desert. And on the other side over here is desert, down into here. Okay? What you have are right here, you can see the little lines going down. You have the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And then over here you have the Mediterranean Sea, you have the Nile down here. You probably can't read, you can see there's little black, like these are towns and cities along the Nile, towns and cities along the Mesopotamian valley with the Tigris and Euphrates. And then you have bodies of water here and the Jordan River in here. In the ancient world, there were battles for control. So in order to have a big civilization, you have to have trade. And trade exists at that time, basically by foot or by animal carrying things over long distances. And there are some things that you need in a nation that you can't totally develop internally, so you need some stuff from outside. So you had this series of these different conquerings. So one of the stories we tell is that the story of this part of the world, which we now call Israel, Palestine, Gaza, etc., even Lebanon and Syria, these were areas that were conquered and reconquered. The story of the Hebrew people is being conquered and reconquered. And why is that? Well, because here are the mighty powers, right? The Egyptian Empire for the longest time, the Assyrian, Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Akkadian, all of those empires that were all in the area of Persia here. Eventually, you have Greece and Rome. And what they need is a way to get stuff from here, this fertile area here, to this fertile area here. Well, that's the direct route, but you can't go across here. You can't carry enough water to survive that trip. So what you have to do is go the long way, and you go up through the fertile valley areas, and then you come back down into here, right? Or you go back this way. Eventually, they start being able to navigate a little bit by sea, but that still doesn't get you over here. So this becomes this really crucial area. And you have people following those trade routes and engaging in that work who are moving in and out, right? They're sojourning. It becomes a cultural norm in this culture, so Egyptian culture, in Hebrew, Canaanite, Palestinian, Lebanese culture, in all the Mesopotamian cultures, the Persian cultures, all throughout this area, the cultural tradition is one of welcome. You welcome people. If you have ever known somebody who grew up in this part of the world, who comes from that culture, and you go over to their house to say hi, come hungry. They're going to feed you, and you're going to be there, and they're going to welcome you, and they're going to treat you very well. Why are they going to do that? Because the expectation is that they might someday be traveling, and they would need that same sort of hospitality. You might recall the story, the post-resurrection story in Luke of they're on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus is walking with these two people. They consider him a stranger? Yes. And they're walking along with him, and then he says, as they come to the late evening, they stop at their home, and he says, well, I'm going to go on. And they say, no. It's dangerous at night. That's when so you should stay here. They're welcoming to him. And that's, in part, that and the shared meal is when they realize who this is. When they engage in this sort of spirit of welcoming. So that's a story that we have in our Bible. We can also look at Genesis 18. Genesis 18, 19, 20 is a story here on Pride Weekend that is often aimed at our LGBTQ plus folks it's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So it's the story that's often aimed at them as an example of God rejecting homosexuality. Well, let's read the story. Shall we? We have some time. We're all together. Genesis 18. God appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre. This will be the Reader's Digest version. While he sat at the entrance of his tent in the day's heat. Abraham looked up, and suddenly he saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from his tent entrance to greet them, and he bowed deeply. He said, "Sirs, if you would be so kind, just don't pass by your servant." I mean, listen to that language, right? Please let me help you. Please let me. Right? Let a little water be brought so you may wash your feet and refresh yourselves under the tree. Let me offer you a little bread so that you will feel stronger, and after that you may leave your servant and go on your way. And they said, thank you, that'd be great. And so what does Abraham do? He calls to Sarah, and she comes, it says, and she takes 3 measures of flour to make bread. So a measure of flour is what you would make for bread for a single day. So she makes 3 days worth of bread, and then this is the classic biblical thing, he kills the fatted calf, which from a ranching perspective is not very smart. It's the best meat, but it's the tenderest meat, but it's also the young animal that you really want to raise up so that you can increase your herd. Right? So it's a costly kind of a wasteful kind of thing. So he does, let me bring you a little bread and something to eat, a little water, and this lavish spread that he lays out for them. Massive amounts of bread, the choicest of the foods, all of that kind of stuff that he gives to them. Now, the side part of that story is that the three men, wink wink, who are angels, or somehow sort of representing the divine, tell Sarah that she's going to have a son. And of Sarah, of course, in her 80s, Abraham in his 90s, yeah. Sarah laughs. Right. Maybe out of this is ridiculous, and maybe out of are you freaking kidding me, right? So that's Isaac's birth that is announced in that moment. But what I really want us to focus on is here's this lavish display of generosity to these strangers, this incredible welcome to these strangers. Then you have this little second part right in the middle where the strangers say, we're going on to Sodom, which is a town of, let's say, ill repute. And so they're going to head on that way, and Abraham starts having this conversation with God, in which he bargains with God, and he says, the men turned away and walked toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing in front of the Lord. Abraham approached and said, "Will you really sweep away the innocent with the guilty?" So that you should know before that, God says to the 3 men and to Abraham, the cries of injustice from Sodom and Gomorrah are countless, and their sin is very serious. I will go down to examine the cries of injustice that have reached me. I'm going to take some action here. And Abraham says, will you really sweep away the innocent with the guilty? What if there are 50 innocent people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not save the place for the sake of 50 innocent people in it? It's not like you, God, to do this. You're merciful and just. And God says, all right, if there are 50 innocent people, I will do that. And Abraham says, okay, how about 35? Right? And so Abraham sort of talks him down, sort of bargains his way down to, what if there, oh, Abraham, don't be angry with me, my Lord, but let me speak just once more. What if there are 10, right? Okay, I won't destroy it because of those 10. So he gets it down to 10 people, okay? That's a part of the story we don't really think about very much, but there's this sort of bargaining that goes on. Then we go to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the 3 men enter the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the reaction that they have there. Now, Lot is there, who's Abraham's brother, is in the city. They come into the city. The reaction that they get from the townspeople is very different than Abraham's reaction. They are not welcoming in the slightest. Lot takes them in, acts like Abraham to them. Come in and I will protect you and keep you. And then we get this perhaps hyperbolic kind of situation in which the townspeople come to Lot's house and they demand, pound on the door, demand, set those strangers out here so that we may know them, in the biblical way of knowing them, so that we may attack them, right? So that we may rape them is really essentially what is happening. And the story is really quite awful, because what Lot does is say, instead of that, I have 2 daughters, like take them instead, right? So basically rape them instead, right? Which is very, very troubling to us, but I also want us to understand in that hyperbolic sense, in the same way that the meal that Abraham would have offered to those strangers would have been seen by people as kind of ridiculous, really over the top, and quite wasteful. There's no way they could eat that much food. They were endangering their own. They're out in the desert too, so they only have so many supplies, he and Sarah. So not only were they endangering their own lives, this was just kind of a pointless, way over the top, ridiculous kind of thing. This thing from Lot would have been seen even by people then as ridiculous and over the top. Like, yeah, defend these guys, but you don't give them your daughters. That's ridiculous. And you can see it's not a thing about homosexuality. It's not a thing about sex at all. It's a thing about power and control and humiliation. So what's offered by Abraham and Sarah is generosity and compassion and welcome, hospitality. What's offered by Sodom and Gomorrah is brutality, aggression, scapegoating, perhaps, right? It's the exact opposite. If you don't read all of those stories together, you don't see how this is a balance. This is showing you, in a very hyperbolic way, this is the divine thing to do, this is the not divine thing to do. Does that make sense? And it's all built on this notion of the cultural importance of welcoming the stranger. And then that theme cycles again and again and again throughout biblical texts. Up to and including in our New Testament stories, when the point of Jesus so often is to welcome the people that even his own disciples won't welcome, right?
What I find interesting, that misinterpreted, and then, even years later it is because of, the criminal act of sodomy.
Right. Right. So the criminal act of sodomy comes from this word Sodom, right? Which is, again, a misunderstanding of what is happening there. It's not, because that tends to be applied to, particularly to homosexual men, as a legal term. It is about conquering, not to, I'll try not to get super graphic, but this was a very common thing amongst conquering forces, that the Roman armies did this consistently. They would conquer a place, and the Roman soldiers would rape the defeated soldiers from the other side as a sign of their conquest of them. Again, very patriarchal, so we think about a very patriarchal kind of system. What was so troubling in Roman culture to gay men was not that you would have sex with a man, but that you would be the penetrated, not the penetrator. Because you're giving up your manliness. If you were the penetrator, no problem. Right. Very, very different concepts about sexuality and sex than we have in our modern notion, and to equate one with the other is problematic. In the same way that I would say it's problematic in our cultures to equate that welcome of the stranger in that ancient Middle East world to our world today. We just have a chance to offer some critique about what our policies are, how we look at things, how do we welcome people. Such an individualistic society like we have created in the United States has a real culturally supported problem with identifying with other people and their suffering and their struggle. Even though we embrace this religion that says that's precisely what we should do.
And the same-sex encounters in the ancient world didn't imply any emotional connection.
Correct. Right. Yeah.
Or any long-term kind of relationship.
The relationship between sex and emotions, or between marriage and love, these are totally different things. I mean, for us to suggest that if I said to you, you should marry the person that you fall in love with, is that a controversial statement to you? It sure would be in the ancient world. It'd be like, what are you talking about? Yeah, you marry for the connections. That's right. You marry for that thing that you get. You marry for the dowry, or you marry for the family ties that it makes. You marry in order to continue your status. You don't marry for love. Yeah. And in the Roman world, they would have thought, that's crazy. I mean, that's what you have your mistresses for. This is where you have your love. To love your wife was seen as weakness. You're duty bound to your wife. Yeah. Or, more appropriately, she is duty bound to you. Let's be real. So the hospitality becomes a virtue in part because of the geography of where they are, the danger that is all around them, and there's only certain places where you can be, where you have a chance of surviving. And hospitality plays a major role in that if you're traveling across great distances. Biblical principles, things like hospitality to the stranger, generosity to those in need, care for those widows and orphans. That's that Bible-ese for the vulnerable. Who's vulnerable, and what's our approach to those who are vulnerable? And there's always this sort of added thing, especially again in that Hebrew text. We are caring to the vulnerable, for someday we may be, or someday in the past we have been. Yeah, right? Other biblical principles relating to immigration issues are found all throughout Hebrew Bible and into the New Testament, which state some sort of obligation to governing authorities, but also wants us to care for the foreigner. So God wants us to be people of justice and mercy. And like one of the passages that gets brought up is Romans, so you have fidelity to the legal authorities or to the government that's at. But that's taken out of context. When you read the whole context of that, it's really about, and yet justice and mercy ought to guide what we do. Right? We can see the call to hospitality for our immigrant neighbors in Deuteronomy 10, where God commands the Hebrews to love the foreigner because they were once foreigners in Egypt. And there's that phrase again. That's a clarion call in the Hebrew text, constant reminder of past informing future. We're to care for the refugee because we were once refugees is not a statement of literal fact, like I was never a refugee, for instance, but as a recognition of our roots and our past and our history. We care for immigrants because we all have immigrants as part of our story. We may just need to go back a few generations. We may need to understand that some of that immigration was by choice and some of it was not by choice. but it was immigration nonetheless. So how do we care for those? Biblically speaking, we can infer that God generally wants, for example, for families to be reunified and for impoverished individuals to find work, to have the dignity, to have the people to have the resources that they need. At the same time, yes, we are still called in some way to respect the rule of law in various passages, so we could advocate for secure and functional borders. I don't think care for the stranger equates with we should just do away with all borders and everything, However, if we only take that hardline approach, which is we only are called to respect the rule of law, then we fail to show God's compassion. As I said last week, when I thought there's no way I could do 4 classes on immigration, the reason that I can't do 4 classes on immigration is because the Bible's very clear of this. It's puzzling to me. It is one of the places where I feel like the church has carte blanche to push back against immigration laws. I mean, I think that there's hardly any wiggle room without some really suspect biblical gymnastics to get past the scriptural push, which brings us to the question of, how much we always wrestle with this tension of people who call themselves biblical literalists and yet are not. They pick and choose their biblical literalism. And to be fair, we all do that. We all read into the things that we want to do. We all pick and choose kind of I really want to lean on this and don't want to lean on other things. I'm very guilty of emphasizing that particular things come from a different culture and time, and in some cases, and then in other cases trying to take them exactly into our culture and time. And immigration is one of them. This is a different world in which they live. And we just cannot emphasize enough the cultural differences, how significant they are, and just the mere fact of being a sojourner, knowing that any one of us could go right now, drive across town, and get on a plane and be almost anywhere else in the world by dinner time. Maybe not from Tulsa International Airport. Dinner time tomorrow. Right? Is a monumental difference in what this world was like. And so the sojourning, and not only could we do that, but for those of us with any measure of means at all, would have really no problem feeding ourselves and getting some shelter or doing those kinds of, even if you were just hanging out in the airport, you could probably figure out all of those kind of things pretty easily. Traveling just from town to town in one small section can be very problematic. It's why we have a Good Samaritan story. Traveling from one town to another, which is just a short walk, could be a very dangerous thing and could be a very problematic thing for any number of reasons. So sojourning or being a stranger or doing this kind of migration is a very difficult thing to just... Plus we have a whole new capacity now for that kind of movement. So when you talk about all of these different nation states kind of conquering each other and moving around and who's in control, you have war going on then. And war would displace people, very much as it does today. So tomorrow night, we'll be joined here by Stephanie Saldana with Magic City Books and Congregation B'nai Emunah. And Stephanie Saldana is an author who is a journalist who's traveled a lot throughout this area. And this past book is looking particularly at refugees from war and how do they keep their culture, how do they take, what things do they take and keep with them. And what she found is, people who've been in Syria who are now in Turkey or now in other parts of the world scramble to find ingredients because they want to cook this one particular thing, right? They want to have this meal again. She found someone who had sewn this beautiful garment with pictures of what she remembered from her hometown, locations and things like that she had just sewn onto this garment that she kept with her. So that's all part of that push out of war that we can now do at a much larger scale. So now those refugees are not just coming, little ways over here. How do the Hebrews get to Egypt in the first place? Well, there's drought. They're famine. So they come here where there's a rich, fertile, and they eventually end up in slavery and then return after the Exodus story, right? That's a very common tale. And one that is a little the same, but also different now. The displacement due to war, a little the same. That's still happening for sure. But where they get displaced to might be huge. You may have somebody from... I guess my time's up. I don't know what that is. You may have somebody from the Syrian war displaced and are now living in Canada. Well, that's a pretty big cultural shift. Right. So how do they take these things along with them? And how do we, on the other end of that, act as welcoming agents? It's a biblical imperative. Any questions about immigration? Yeah, I'm going to give you the mic, though. And I always harp on this, so.
So really a comment.
Yeah.
We have always given privilege to immigrants that look like us and speak the same language as we do.
Not always, but we'll talk about that in a
typically,
second.
well,
Yes.
I mean, not the Irish,
Yeah.
of course.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second. But
But when people look different than us and they speak a different language than us, we have a whole different value set about that. And we love to hearken to our own immigrant heritage, and yet we don't embrace that. And I just want to say that, and I didn't understand this really until I started studying social work, that the waves of immigrants that were coming into New York City at the end of the end of the 1800s, end of the early 20th century, they always kept pushing one another aside, and once the Eastern Europeans came in, that started this whole xenophobia, the last wave of it, that still trickles down to where we are today.
Yeah.
So it's not even just Europeans that get a bye. It's Eastern Europeans are a whole different cultural place for us than Western Europeans.
Yep.
So
becomes very complicated, and
it does.
We have a long history in the country of accepting when we need work, accepting people who will work, right? So in an era post slavery, we were welcoming in people who we could exploit for their work. But then we would stop. So interestingly enough, there's a sort of timing that you can see in immigration law that allows a window for Chinese immigration right about the time the railroads need to be built, and after the railroads are built and up and everything's going, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? That shuts that door. You have that is true certainly within Europe, and you're right that there's this sort of waves of migration. Included in that is this really interesting and troubling kind of thing about what counts as whiteness. So white people were a particular thing, and not this group, and then then the Irish slowly became white, and then the Polish slowly became white, and the Italians slowly became white, and so you have all of that happening as you need to redefine, because it's always in immigration, it's always this us versus them kind of thing going on. There's not the hospitality component. There's not the biblical command is treat the stranger as if they were part of you. And that gets said over and over again. But what we tend to do is, even if we treat the stranger decently, it's treat the stranger as second class in some way. Right?
They're not extended family.
Not extended family, yeah. And not to do the thing where we see ourselves in them. Right? So we treat them, we care for the foreigner because we were once foreigners. Right. Any other questions, comments?
I have a comment.
That's surprising to me, Fred. You have to use the mic, though.
I'm not sure I want to put it on public.
Well,
record.
sorry. It's too late now, pal.
Going back to seventh, 8th grade, I was always the star of getting laughter in class and
Class clown.
Class clown,
Right.
troublemaker.
Also surprising.
Yeah. And
You grew out of that, though, so thankfully.
I grew out of it. I think I almost succeeded.
You kind of
Come
circled
full
back.
circle.
You're kind of circling back to it, but
Yeah.
yes.
But suddenly, in the 7th grade, there was this teacher who, instead of saying, read this, actually she spoke from experience. She was widely traveled, went to, taught in Japan and several different countries, and for some reason landed at James Madison in West Tulsa. And I remember in particular, where she got them, she never said, but she had film strips of Ellis Island. And she went through a period where she would show us a film strip every day, a short one. And there were the faces and people dressed all in all kinds of manners.
Yeah.
And you'd see them, and there would be, have you been to that building, the Ellis Island building? Well, I've only been there once, but it sent a chill through me because of those
You remember
videos
those,
I'd
yeah.
seen.
Yeah.
And the different kinds of people that came through there that I had seen on those, and knowing that they went into New York, and then from there, who knows, and we welcomed them. And then she tied it to the Statue of Liberty and the saying at the bottom. And that was probably the first sermon I ever listened to.
Yeah, without even knowing it.
Without knowing it.
Yeah.
And so anybody who speaks to me about immigration and being bad for the country, I've never seen it.
Yeah.
And I think the evidence backs that up.
Oh, it does. It does. It does.
I
Well,
wish I could remember that teacher's name. I've got a postcard from her.
you remember our sermon, and so that's
Yeah.
half of it. So next week, we're going to come and talk about bodily autonomy in the Bible, right? It's actually, interestingly enough, we probably got into worse stuff today than we'll get into. But look forward to seeing you over at worship, and I'll leave us with what I think is probably really the most important point.
Is this going to be the sermon today?
It's just going to be.
Into this?
Right. It's just going to stay put. Yeah. Thank you all.